So you finally finished that novel and now it's time to edit and revise. Well, luckily I'm here to offer you a few tips when it comes to line editing to make your story more cohesive and more stronger. These are actually some of the same things that I look for when I'm editing a novel for a client. And along with these tips and suggestions, I will also be showing you examples for those of you who are visual learners so you have something to compare your work to. First up, we have weak description. And I know that none of you out there have this problem, but just in case, here's an example. Paul reached for the handgun, but the man in the trench coat pulled the trigger. A flash of light exploded in front of Paul's face, which caused him to collapse on the stage. The flow of his blood formed a red pool of blood around him. To me, these sentences read more along the lines of how someone would relay events to a friend. And that's okay in everyday speech, but in writing, we need to be more creative. So I took the time to rewrite this sentence and try to find a way to make it more creative, make it flow better. So here is that example. Paul reached for the gun, but not before the man in the trench coat pulled the trigger. A flash of light exploded in front of Paul's face, causing him to collapse on the stage. David watched as a red pool of blood formed around him. You may have noticed that I added the name of the character to the last sentence. Because the narrator is describing this event through the eyes of the main character, I felt that it would be better to add his name. That way you can get more perspective or insight into how the main character is viewing this event. Another thing you may need to look for when line editing your novels is excessive telling. A lot of times as author, we tend to describe things using more than one sentence when it can be done in just one. And here's an example where an author used several sentences to describe the eyes of a character. She had a pretty little face with almond-shaped eyes. Her eyes seemed gray or brown. Here, in my opinion, is a better way to describe this. She had a pretty little face with almond eyes that were either gray or brown. In the second example, the story flows better. And in my opinion, when you look within your novel and you find these areas where you describe something in several sentences and you can take it and reduce it maybe into one or two, that helps the flow of the story. These are those instances where you may read a review on Goodreads or Amazon and you see that someone has said that even though the book was kind of long, that it was a quick read. In this way, you sort of give your story a cadence, a sort of a rhythm that keeps the reader there. Another thing that you may need to look for when line editing your story is redundancy. There are times where as authors, we repeat the same word over and over again in a paragraph, and those are the times that the stories can come in handy. For this example, I chose a passage where the author uses the word glass a bit excessively. Surrounding the quiet lounge against the wall were 6 glass bookshelves about 6 feet tall, filled with hundreds of books. They particularly took over an entire wall. The inky treasures of words adorned the room. The architecture was modern and custom-made, as if carved by someone who truly loved literature. The shelves were glass, transparent with a mirror base. She was sure there was probably at least 500 books on the shelves and almost lost her breath at the sight. Is that glass? It looks so delicate and expensive, she thought. Here, looking at the last sentence where the author has the main character questioning whether or not the bookshelves are made of glass, I think this is where the author is trying to separate the character from the narrator and letting us know that the character is unsure whether or not the bookshelves are made of glass. But I think a better way to have done this is to not include the word glass in the description of the bookcase. Maybe she could have used words that were similar to glass, as in clear or transparent, or she could have described how the lighting in the room bounced off the bookshelves, and in that way, when she questions whether or not the bookshelves are made of glass, it comes over better to the reader. Another thing that you should look for when line editing your story is repetitive words. A lot of times as writer, we have certain words that are familiar to us and we use them very often throughout the manuscript. It is good to go back and find out whether or not you need these words within the sentences. A few of those words are actually, really, just, probably, and nice. The best way to find out whether or not these words are necessary to the story you are telling is to go back and rewrite the sentence without these words and see if you are able to get that same thought across to the reader without them. Here is another example. I was probably just being paranoid. The place really had been only 3 miles down the road. Here is that same sentence written without those repetitive words. I was being paranoid. The place had been only 3 miles down the road. To me, alleviating those words still gets the same thought across to the reader, and I did not feel that they were necessary in this instance. Another thing that you should look for when not only line editing but also in revisions is inconsistency. I have actually come across a lot of this when reading indie books. Yes, it does happen in traditionally published books, but oftentimes I come across it more in indie writers. And I think the reason for this is that a lot of authors tend to revise when they end a chapter or end a scene. In my opinion, I think that it is best to wait till the end of the novel before you begin the revision process. However, if you feel like you cannot wait, I would have an extra set of eyes read over these chapters as you end them. While writing the second novel in my Interwoven series, I actually have my character musing as to how he was going to figure out where one of his neighbors lived. And when I had the person who I have look over my work read the pages that I'd written, they noticed that I had the character musing as to where his neighbor lived, but a few pages later, he walks down his street to her house, which is only a couple of houses away. And he pointed out, of course, he knows where she lives. She's right down the street. In a recent novel, I noticed how the author had the main character come downstairs wearing nothing but a pair of boxers. However, a few pages later, he's patting his pockets on his pants looking for his keys. Also, there were many instances of other inconsistencies, especially with timelines within the story. And I think that if you have someone who is willing to read these pages over for you, I mean, you don't have to pay an editor. You can find a friend who's going to be honest with you that can point these inconsistencies out for you. So now that I've given you a few tips, what are some ways that you can go about line editing your novel? For me, one of the best ways is to print out several pages of my novel. For me, I found out that it's better to have the words against a white background. For some reason, I'm able to find mistakes that I did not see when staring at a computer screen. And I've talked to other writers who have had this same problem. I remember when I published my first book and I had a copy on it and I decided to sit down on the couch and read it, that I found all these mistakes that not only the people that I have given the book to read had missed, but I as well. I mean, there were parentheses that were nowhere near this dialogue. There were words that were missing. There were words that did not belong. And to be honest, I am ashamed that I put this out there into the world. And had I known what I knew then, I would have taken my time with that book and waited to put it out. Another thing that can be helpful when line editing your story is having the computer read the story aloud to you. I know that Word has this option, and I'm unsure if Google has added it or not, and whether or not Scriber or some other formats that writers use when creating their novels. But having the computer read it aloud to you can help you find some of those A's that you missed, some of those At's that you missed. A lot of times you can find S's or EDs that should have been in the story. And not only is it good at helping you find these mistakes, it can also help you with the creative process. It can help you figure out where a sentence would sound better, would maybe add this word or change around the way it's written. Another helpful way when line editing your story is read the story aloud. You yourself can read the story aloud, but I suggest that you go about this slowly, taking your time, because a lot of times the brain likes to fill in those gaps and we miss a lot of things. So take your time and read the story slowly, and you can find things that you have missed when reading them quickly on a computer. And another way that I found that is helpful that I learned when taking my creative writing courses is to read the sentence backwards. And I'm not saying as in she bought a cow and then cow a bought she, but take a paragraph and take an individual sentence at the end, read it backwards. Again, this is very helpful in those instances where the brain likes to fill in the gaps. However, this method is great when it comes to line editing, but not very helpful in whole revisions or content editing. And just know, these tips are not just helpful when it comes to revising your novel. They can also be beneficial to you if you are a blogger or you're writing articles or even for research papers. So that concludes today's video. Check me out next week when I offer you a few more tips when it comes to line editing. I hope that something I said here today can be helpful to you, and I want to wish you good luck on your writing journey.